I'm Clinton Griffiths. New momentum on the trade front between the U.S. and China. President Trump having a phone call with China's President Xi Jinping on Thursday, with President Trump calling it a good phone call with a very positive conclusion. Now, Trump posting an update on Truth Social saying he had a very good call with Xi that lasted an hour and a half, saying it focused almost entirely on trade. He said it, quote, resulted in a very positive conclusion for both countries, end quote. Now, President Trump says an in-person meeting is now planned between the two countries. Representing the U.S. will be key people in Trump's cabinet, including the Treasury Secretary, Secretary of Commerce, and U.S. Trade Representative. The news comes a day after President Trump expressed some frustration over talks with China, posting this on Truth Social on Wednesday, saying, quote, I like President Xi of China, always have, always will, but he is very tough and extremely hard to make a deal with, end quote. And Farm Journal's Tyne Morgan is at World Pork Expo on the grounds as this news hit. Tyne, some positive trade news just a day after President Trump voiced frustration over the difficulty in making a deal with President Xi.
You're exactly right, Clinton. The trade whiplash, well, it continues, but the news on Thursday seems extremely positive. I was talking to AgriTalk's Chip Flory just as the news hit on Thursday, and he said President Trump is sending in his A-team for trade negotiations, and you don't do that unless you're expecting a trade deal. Look, progress is welcome for pork producers and the entire pork industry here at World Pork Expo, as uncertainties surrounding China are also creating uncertainties around the outlook for demand and prices the rest of this year.
And on the beef and pork side, it's particularly important. About 15% of our exports go to China. You're talking out of $19 billion between beef and pork sales. You've got about $2.5 billion that's China. So while we're always working to diversify away from China, it's still one of the biggest margin, higher margin value markets for some, especially variety meats. But this goes a long ways in starting to put some of that uncertainty to rest. And there's a lot more work to be done. I mean, it's not just about tariffs. There's a lot of non-tariff trade barriers as well around China. So it would never have happened without this first step.
Clinton, bottom line, we still don't have a concrete deal, and that's what traders in the market are really waiting for. And we know this news can change daily, but the latest news is at least positive, with both sides appearing to be willing to make a deal. Clinton?
All right, thanks, Tyne. Ahead of that call, USDA released its weekly export sales numbers for the final days of May. It shows China bought 12,700 metric tons of pork, about 700 metric tons more than Mexico. Sales of pork climbed nearly 20% the week of May 29th. Michelle Rook joins us. And Michelle, how is the market reacting to these trade negotiations and headlines?
Clinton, the ag market reaction was positive, but I would call it overall muted to the trade developments with China on Thursday. In fact, market analysts say for the last month, the grain market in particular has become numb to the headlines due to the slow progress, not just on China trade, but all of the trade deals. The phone call between Presidents Trump and Xi and a follow-up meeting are encouraging, but most of the agricultural markets want signs of more progress. Plus, these talks aren't focused on agriculture.
And I think President Trump reaching out to President Xi is an effort to move things forward. But I think we need to be cautious about assuming that this is going to lead to a quick resolution of the multitude of issues that we have with China. And I think the urgency for the United States has now increased. It's become a focus on rare earth minerals.
China is the primary source of those minerals, so he says they're using that and the ITC appeals court ruling on tariffs, which could come soon, to slow play negotiations.
If President Trump wins this one, he's still got more fighting to do on his legal battles. President Xi believes with all those legal battles, it is to his advantage to just long play this, to slow walk these negotiations, that perhaps Trump will lose in the court system and he won't have to, and President Xi won't have to give up anything.
Even with tariffs cut and delayed 90 days, U.S. ag exports to China have been rare. The 12,700 metric ton pork sale Thursday followed net cancellations last week, but is important as they buy variety meats.
1.5% of our total production is exported to China. Some pretty round numbers, and it changes year to year, but that's a pretty good guess on how much they matter in the grand scheme of things. So from a trend perspective, it's fantastic to see China back buying again.
Yet the ag markets overall are getting tired of the lack of progress on China or any trade deals.
That's all we have is basically a little bit of a handshake deal with the UK. So there's a lot of deals out there, and some of the bulls are, I mean, that's one of the headlines, that the bulls are hoping and expecting at some point in here to boost these markets, and we just have not seen anything like that.
So markets need to see concrete trade deals, or more importantly, actual sales before rallying. I'm Michelle Rook reporting for Ag Day.